I would say we have a very interesting presentation today. I'm interested in seeing it in more detail as well. I'd like to begin, though, with a land acknowledgement. So today I'm sitting in my beautiful home office in Ottawa on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation and people, and this is where I live, work, and really enjoy my life. I recognize that many of you are coming from across Canada, so I welcome you to this conversation and look forward to today. I'm going to pass it over to Bob Weissman, but before I do, I just want to introduce him for those who don't know him. He does have a PhD in engineering, and he's also PMP certified. He's a professor at the University of Ottawa in Digital Transformation and Innovation Program, and here he created the Enterprise Architecture and Enterprise Modeling course, both for graduate and undergraduate level. Bob is a military man. He spent over 30 years in government, starting as a civil and military engineer, specializing in plan and operations, and has been at the forefront of digital transformation in the Canadian Forces. One of his major career challenges was in standing up the creation and evolution of the Canadian Defence Information Services Office. Subsequent to retiring, Bob moved on and did 10 years at CGI as an executive management consultant, where he founded the enterprise architect practice, and he consulted for governments around the world, including those in Europe, US, Australia, and even working with NATO itself. When he retired, that wasn't enough. He went and pursued a PhD in digital transformation and innovation, and he's teaching in this area now. He's also the CEO of the Build Division, where he works closely with the Open Group Architecture and Archimate forums, as well as the cross-forum Enterprise Architecture and Government. He is president of ISACA, Ottawa Valley Chapter. This is an international professional association focused on IT governance, and the Association of Enterprise Architects for the Ottawa Gatineau area, and he's chairing the annual Digital Transformation and Government Conference, which kicks off next week, I believe, on the 14th. As you can see, Bob is a pretty busy man, very steeped in experience in these areas, particularly in enterprise architect and business transformation. We're very fortunate to have Bob here to speak with us today and really start the conversation of what is the role of the consultants in these large business transformation projects. Again, if you can just post your question in the chat function, I will make sure Bob, they get to Bob's attention. So welcome, Bob, over to you.
Okay, great. Well, today I'm going to be delighted to talk about digital transformation and enterprise architecture, and hopefully maybe dispel some myths and have you change the way that you perceive enterprise architecture as the way it's being practiced and the way it should be practiced. Okay, you've seen my background. The main thing is right now is I was in a UN forum, United Nations forum, and this was about 3 years ago, and they basically made a distinction between 3 different forms of digital transformation. So let me just go through them. Digitization was conceived to be a change from the manual and analog to the digital. So it was just basically throwing technology at the issue, no business process re-engineering, nothing. You were just replacing certain things with technology. We did a lot of that in the 70s and 80s, and we're still doing that today in areas. Digitalization is often meant to be a narrow process-centric application of technology, and it basically is there to streamline operations and to cut costs. So you're doing business process re-engineering in one area, for example, issuing hunting licenses and the like. So digitalization is sort of it's a step up from digitization. The challenge with digital transformation is that you're focusing on the creation of a vision. They talk about the customer-centric value proposition, but the main thing is that you're going across the enterprise. So you're dealing at the portfolio level and the program level, and really minimally at the project level. Okay, for that. So digital transformation, when I use it in this conversation, and when most people globally are using it, they're dealing with transformation at the enterprise level. Okay, for that. So I will be basing this presentation on digital transformation. Okay, so that's just be absolutely clear. Now, a useful definition of enterprise architecture. Enterprise architecture is the explicit knowledge of the assets available to an enterprise, and that's all assets available to an enterprise, not just the technology stuff, their value, how they're related, and how they evolve over time. Okay, and that's it. This is not just technology. We're dealing across the board. And right now, one of the major concerns you have to consider are data, information, and knowledge assets. In actual fact, they're the most valuable asset globally. They surpassed oil about 4 or 5 years ago. So you can't do this in an ad hoc manner. And enterprise architecture is more than just data management, but certainly it's a key. And the initial enterprise architecture frameworks, their first concern was data. And we're going back to the 1980s. So that's where enterprise architecture was born. And a lot of it evolved from the military, where I was involved with the defense science side of the house, transforming. So it's just something to keep in mind. This is not a technology description. And when you're taking a look at enterprise architecture in the US government, they have the common approach to architecture, and it's down at the title. They're basically taking into account standards, configuration management, portfolio management, capital planning, portfolio management, security, privacy, strategic plans, business. Anyways, and then you look at the outer circles, you're dealing with complete integration. They don't talk digital transformation, they just talk transformation. Because for them, digital is simply a tool, a means with which they can basically move their organizations forward. So this far exceeds the mandate of 99% of the CIOs, certainly in Canada. So this is the way the United States has gone. This was pre the previous incumbent, and now with the President Biden in place, they're basically bringing this up to date. Now, this comes from the Office of the Management and Budget, which is the equivalent of our Treasury Board. Okay, for that. So just to show you that enterprise architecture has long, in certain countries, has long been outside the mantra of strictly the CIO box. Okay, for that. Now, a new way of looking at enterprise architecture is you have a business architecture. How does a business fit together? You have the information architecture. How does the data and information support the business? You have the applications architecture, the services. You have the technology architecture, which is the underlying information infrastructure, if you want to call it something. Then the security architecture. Security architecture is sometimes done outside of EA. I've never done an enterprise architecture in my 30 years without having security upfront. And this is a major challenge because when you take a look at a lot of the frameworks, security is sort of an afterthought. It's not in the Canadian government, okay? But some other places, they just use the business information technology and applications. Now, enterprise architecture sits right in the middle. You're trying to coordinate that. And when you look at the coordination aspect, the business architecture is not just, a business process, some BPMN method notation. You're dealing with competencies, you're talking with people, you're dealing with business transformation, you're dealing with moving the people along. So enterprise architecture is no longer just a technology wiring diagram. It's something just to keep in mind. So there's many professions. The enterprise architect, sort of, generally speaking, they're an expert in one of these fields, but they're basically a jack of all trades. And you could add in privacy architecture, you can add in HR, there's all sorts of different aspects that you can look at the enterprise through. So these are lenses through which you look at the enterprise. Now, the three components of enterprise architecture, and this was a major problem when we were consulting, was that you have to know where you are, okay, or the baseline architecture, okay? It's basically often, it's not a pretty picture. You have to know where you want to go. And you got to get a plan to get there. What I saw in most of the enterprise architectures was that people would sit there and pedal the target without figuring out how you're going to get there. And for me, that's a major cause of failure in digital transformation. Enterprise architecture is just a structured planning technique, okay? It's no more than that. And if you don't have those three components in enterprise architecture, you're not going to go anywhere. Now, is this unique to enterprise architecture? No, this is just planning 101. And when you take a look at the enterprise architecture cycle, what you do is you start off with planning, basically what's in, what's out, the contextual side of it. Then what happens is you come up with a vision. Where do you want to go? Conceptual. Then you come up with definition, where you're basically getting into some of the nuts and bolts, but you try to make it technology independent. Why? Because you want to go to RFP. I'm sorry, I'm assuming that you understand request for proposal and request for quotes. These are the things that when you go have a request for proposal, you have to make sure that the deliverables fit together. And then the enterprise architecture transformation, you've got to figure out, okay, fine, this is where I want to go. How am I going to get there? You have to implement it. That's one reason when I was at CGI, one of the first things I said for the EA practice, everybody has to be a project management professional. In those days, they didn't have portfolio management professionals and all that. So I said, you've got to know how to plan. You've got to make things real. And then you have to go through implementation and governance to make sure when you put the architecture in place that it actually works and fits and people are adhering to it. That sounds trivial, but it's not, because often projects get the money and they're gone, last seen. Okay, and they spend it the way they want. So the enterprise architecture cycle, and when you're doing planning, to be quite honest with you, there's not much of a difference. What the architecture does is give you a structured framework with which to help in planning. Now, when you're doing enterprise architecture, one of the foundations of the TOGAF, and by the way, TOGAF is used in the vast majority of the Global 50 and the Fortune 500 companies. Okay, they virtually all use enterprise architecture, and 70% of them use TOGAF. Is capability-based planning. Now, where did that come from? That came from government. And where did government get it from? The military, where they looked at capabilities and they looked at implementing capability increments, i.e. not waterfall. So basically what they call now agile, this was always part of the delivery mechanism. And when you looked at capabilities, you looked at the people, process, and material dimensions. When I was building a data center, I had to, part of the responsibility, it wasn't technology. I mean, the biggest concern I had was the civil engineering side of the house, getting the building up and figuring out how we could work on the bottom floor while they were still putting on top the top 2 floors. These were the type of issues that you have to be associated with. Training the people. Okay, collective training. When you have a value chain, normally speaking, you have a series of activities. It's no good in just creating systems that do part of the value chain. You've got to get to that outcome. Professional development. Oh, we want to do artificial intelligence. Well, okay, we have to work on that. Okay, this will not happen overnight. Understand the concepts, the business processes, the information management. In the bad old days that I unfortunately can very well remember, I had to know cold the entire filing system and all the how information was stored and archived. I find now people often say, oh, that's a CIO's job. No, it's not. It's the business job. It's a management job. And these are the things that have to get back to the business if you want to get a grip on your information management. Okay, for that. Now, also material. Okay, you've got infrastructure, you've got your information technology, and you have your equipment. You notice information management, information technology are separate. And certainly now we're seeing that with the CDOs, the creation of the Chief Data Officer, which has just been created. Steve Burtz has taken that job over in the Government of Canada. Okay, and the whole idea is right now is, yeah, I see that in the chat. It was meant to be a common, yeah, TOGAF was used and it came from the DND, it came from the Department of Defense, and we used to be called the Technical Architecture for Information Management, not IT. It was always the technical architecture to support information management. So it was always data centric, okay, for that. And this was developed, and I was using that back in the early 90s. I was using that in the early 90s. When I was over at Defense, where we set up the Defense Information Services Organization, which is now known as Assistant Deputy Minister Information Management, but it's basically a CTO job. So anyways, life evolves. But the whole idea is that you're not just looking at the technology parts. There are 2 dimensions. Can you have extra dimensions? Sure, you have R&D, research and development. Certainly in Defense, we always had our research and developments because we knew we wanted to do. We had no idea how to do it. And there's an entire research and development arm, which is world-class, that works in D&D. And if D&D couldn't handle it, you could basically go out to the universities, or you can go out to the National Research Council. We have a lot of smart people in Canada. So even if you don't know how to do it, get some money and put it aside, seed money, and then you'll find a way of doing it. And when you're dealing, for example, healthcare, they sort of said the medical records in Ontario were a bit of a problem. It's a complicated thing, okay? And you can't do this on an ad hoc basis. Can you imagine if you had a project for each one of them and there was no overall coherent structure that basically told you how they would fit together? That's what was happening in many cases. Why? Because people got so frustrated that they basically struck out on their own, which is exactly the same thing that happened in the 1980s. Okay, when you had a massive number of really successful micro projects, but they couldn't fit together. And that's one reason enterprise architecture was conceived, certainly in the military at that time. And you're also dealing with the big data landscape. And cybersecurity is not how to best describe it? I mean, it is an issue. And before, you used to protect your information systems. But when you take a look at your information systems, now all of a sudden you're introducing your critical infrastructure, your control systems. For example, the water purification plant, okay, would be tied into the information systems. Often these guys are running on operating systems that were conceived in the 1980s and 1990s. Do you really want to hook them up? You have to understand the threat. You have to, so the cyber security architecture is extremely important. And then you get social media. And that's all over the map. It's like the Wild West. Okay, so this is something when you're dealing with the big data landscape, you really have to take all these factors into consideration. And it's not connect because it's neat, we can connect. So the operator for the water purification plant can basically use his mobile phone to do adjustments to the water purification filters. Well, if that makes it vulnerable to hacking, why do we want to do it? He can take an extra 15 or 20-minute drive and go to the plant and basically fix it. So it's connective. You can't connect if necessary, but not necessarily connect. And that's another thing too, from a technology point of view. They often say, well, we can do it, it's possible. But it's up to the architects and the business planners to say, do we really need that? What is the threat? And then you go into standard risk assessment. But the new big data landscape has opened up this environment dramatically. And I'll give you some examples here. And these come from the Center for Information Systems Research over at MIT, Sloan School of Management, Center for Information Systems Research. 7-Eleven, they started something called the store clerk hypothesis. And what they wanted to do was basically get the stuff off the shelves. And they have like 36,000 stores globally. 12,000 of them are in Japan. And before, the clerk was just simply receiving the stuff, would come in, go on the shelf, and he'd basically just be a little salesperson. He ended up making all the ordering decisions, and management provided him with a large information vat, a total information system, and that focused on getting the stuff off the shelf and took advantage of a massive integrated supply chain. This was incredibly useful, okay? I'll answer some of these questions too afterwards, because they'll throw the presentation off, but they're very good ones. Okay.
And Bob, just to let you know, I'm tracking them, so don't worry about it. I got them.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So what happens is the workforce you're dealing with are knowledge workers. They have a decision. So the outcome of this was that in Japan, there were 12,000 stores. Every store was unique to its clientele. We talked about the client-centric value proposition. Every store catered for the people in their own little area. And you know which other one is using that right now? The LCBO, Liquor Commission Board of Ontario. Okay? You take a look at the LCBOs, each one of them carries different stock. Why? Because they cater to their clients. And this was an advantage where they started to say, let's use our smart knowledge workers and basically harness their talents and don't treat them as drones. And this is where we're going from industrial age workers to knowledge-based workers. Now, another example is Campbell's Soup. Now, the enterprise architects, they sort of did a quick, this is where we are picture, which is very useful when you're showing it to executives, saying is, we can't get out, we're going to have to think about how we get out of this. We can't do it in an ad hoc manner. They used enterprise architecture, and what they came is with a digitized process platform. And what they did was centralize their information holdings and basically have the applications or business services hooked onto a main, basically, information hub that basically provided the information. This provided them with an integrated source of reliable information upon which they could base analytics. And it made a dramatic difference in terms of the performance of Campbell's, which was in had fiscal issues. And essentially, it's become a very successful company. So anyways, yes, it does look a lot cleaner, but this was something that the business people could understand. So just having this is baseline, this is target, immediately. They were given 3 years to do strictly technology foundations, planning and implementation, because they had a cogent vision and they knew where they wanted to go. Was it easy? No, but they did it. So this is just an example of an old company. They were around for 137 years, and basically moving them into the 21st century. Delta Airlines was another one where you essentially got your data. Nobody knew when an airplane was taken off. It was a function of which aircraft. So what happens is they standardize their customer experience, they standardize their operational pipeline, and they created a core, what they call the Delta nervous system. And it's an information sharing environment. But to be quite honest with you, that is, how best to describe it, it's good marketing, okay, the Delta nervous system. Basically, you have to be cognizant of what's going to be catchy within the organization. So a little bit of marketing. And that's where, for example, you might have a CTO worrying about the technology, but the CDO would be working about, as chief data officer, would be worrying about what's happening in the data and making sure that it's quality data and that's accessible, and the semantics as well. Okay, for that. Now, the chief information officer, I know it was a question that was posed in the chat. Unfortunately, a lot of them have turned to the chief technology officers. And it's forced the creation of chief data officer organizations, because the original role, and I was there when we set up the Defense Information Services Organization. Okay, it wasn't meant to be network centric, it was meant to be information centric. And I think a lot of CIOs have lost the bubble, and as a consequence now they're coming up with chief data officers. There didn't used to be a gap between IM and IT, like in the Canadian government. That's clearly what's happened. And then the technology gets sort of, tacked on, and it's basically swap in, swap out. But they always keep a grip on their applications, and then they basically also keep a grip on their their information and also their key applications. So they've done a complete rationalization of their infrastructure. Sometimes they call it an info structure, so people don't lose track of the fact it's the information infrastructure and not just the technology infrastructure. So that's another good case study. And when you're dealing, for example, this is sort of the cyber physical system, and this already exists in certain areas. You can't do this without having some overall high-level construct, and that's what enterprise architecture is, not just technology. How are you going to use it? How are you going to secure the information coming from the body area networks? For example, to the user interface, the healthcare data, the remote access. How are you going to do it if I'm all of a sudden on vacation in Poland? Can they get access to my information? It opens up an incredible number of wonderful opportunities, but you can't do it in an ad hoc manner. Okay, you just have to try it out. So let's just keep it out. You need to have a high-level framework, since it's not just technology. And also, one of the big things is that when you're dealing with projects are a real issue, and not just with respect to digital transformation. Often medium-sized government organizations have maybe 200 projects on the go, same thing in companies. But a lot of them are based on incident reports, and you lump a bunch of them together, and to a lot of them, they're operations and maintenance fixes. Okay, like in government, they have a real gap between O&M, operations and maintenance funding, versus capital, which is new spend. And that really is problematic for digital transformation. Now, enterprise architecture provides strategic project generation from the top down in line with an overall vision. However, it still has to enable the bottom up stuff. Okay, when you do gap analysis, sometimes some of the work that has to be done to change from baseline to target is going to be enhancements, which is operations and maintenance funding rather than capital funding for new capabilities. What you really have to do is put integrated governance in, and that's where the management consultants have to be really tight. I've seen organizations where the 95% of the maintenance spend is not coordinated with the capital spend. And what they do is with continuous service improvement, they just keep on spending money on stuff that you want to sunset and get rid of. And generally speaking, with 5 or 10% of the budget, you can't do much in the way of transformation. So you really have to integrate the two to basically get that clear. And it's a management consulting issue that you really have to get a grip on. But enterprise architecture does allow the top down, but it doesn't disallow the bottom up as well. This is another common myth. EA is all top down. It's not. Good EA, sorry. There is a lot of EA that is strictly top down. Now let's take a look at the core issue. Right now, enterprise digital transformation, Forrester quoted a 50% failure rate. The IEEE Engineering Management Review in 2021, okay, in December, basically said it's a 90% failure rate of digital transformation in enterprise. Okay, IT projects in government. The editors, the former editors of the Economist magazine, you might be familiar with that. They basically said it's 94% failure rate in government. Okay, this is not trivial. Software development, it's documented, 60% failure rate. Now, having been a civil engineer, if 60% of my bridges, okay, would be falling down, I think there'd be a little bit of concern. Unfortunately, the public says, oh, it's IT, okay? And, you know, but as far as I'm concerned, this is something we really have to get a grip on. How many trillions of dollars are wasted every year that could better be spent looking for cures for cancer or COVID or monkeypox, or whatever, you know what I mean? Basically improving the quality of life for individuals rather than having a snazzier interface, so to speak, okay? So these are some of the key issues. We have to take a look at that. Now, let's quantitatively take a look at it. Right now, when you have an enterprise architecture where this is highlighted, do you think that this bears out why there are so many issues trying to fix it? This is not trivial. Okay, take a look at the Campbell's. This is worse than the Campbell soup. Okay, so, and this is an actual government department. Okay, so you don't have to go through the entire department. You can do a segment of it and say, you know, we've got to change the way we share information. And this has to be done at the enterprise level. And how can you do it if your software projects are failing? When you take a look at KPMG and predictive analytics, and KPMG said in 1997, 61% of projects failed. It was improved, software, 50% in 2001, but anybody who was there in 2001 would realize that they spent a ton of money doing Y2K. And they didn't fix any of the problems. As a matter of fact, a lot of systems that should have been chucked at that time were given a life extension. Some of them are still around, and it's causing no end of problems. And that's one reason it's led to a recent increase again of software failure. So what we really have to do is figure out, why is this failing? So let's take a look at the failure factors. Everybody says, well, it's technology. I beg to differ. You take a look, unrealistic project goals and expectations. Changing and red, those are all management. Changing or unclear requirements. Okay, insufficient technical knowledge. Well, that could maybe be on the technical front, maybe. Problematic technology. People are throwing stuff in because they've read it in Wired. They say, oh, this is a fantastic, you know, technology, let's use it. Okay, it doesn't work. Okay, lack of executive support. Okay, insufficient user commitment, project cost overruns, project schedule delays, insufficient project management control. It's got the word management written all over it. So let's take a look at each one of these factors. Unrealistic project goals and expectations. Unambiguous vision is what EA contributes to it, okay? Leading to well-formed project charters. It's not a miracle happens here, okay? Basically what happens is, you know where you want to go, you've got a vision, and it's clear cut, and it's well articulated. Otherwise, and even in civil engineering, I mean, you can't create the dancing buildings without knowing which way you're going. Okay, so what happens is you need to have this vision saying is, this is where we want to go. And you get approval for this. Like in EA, they say is before you go into detail, get approval for the high level overview. So don't go diving into details. From my management consulting days, well, I'm still doing management consulting, but it's different. The one project spent all of their money doing business analysis. We're talking $100 million. You could have papered an entire building with all the BPMN maps and all that sort of stuff. They got nothing implemented. Okay. And then the irony was that they bought a software package that had all of these business flows and everything else embedded within it. So they had to change them all. But of course, they wouldn't change them. They rewrote them all to conform with the business analysis. That didn't work very well. Okay. But these are the type of issues. You have to have a vision, unrealistic project goals. And when you say project, we're talking really at the portfolio level. Everything reverts back to project, but these are enterprise level issues. Changing or unclear requirements. Enterprise architecture gets the requirements well articulated. It is central, okay, to enterprise architecture to have coherent requirements. And when you look at it, when you're dealing with an enterprise architecture, it's nothing but a coordinated set of requirements. That's what an architecture is. So enterprise architecture provides the quantitative, clear requirements that you can basically hang your hat on or go to contract with. Insufficient technical knowledge, identification of personal competencies. Once you take a look at the enterprise architecture, it forces you to say is, okay, we've got these technologies, can we do it? Because capability-based planning. And what generally speaking is, you have to figure out what the person in the future is going to look like and what they're going to end up doing. And it's got to be realistic. That's not too realistic, but it's just simply illustrating is that you have to take a look at the HR aspect. Problematic technology, especially now. It used to be very difficult, but you can take a look at new technologies. You can figure out where they can fit, prototyping in sandboxes. All too many people, they ask for innovation, but they don't necessarily have the vehicles with which to implement innovation. You need an innovation environment within the organization so you can take a look at the new stuff. How's quantum computing going to contribute to the organization? And with the simulations you have now, you can take a look at this. Lack of executive support. Enterprise architecture has something, you know, a mechanism such as viewpoints. There's a set of viewpoints onto the architecture that appeal to executives. And then what you can do is you can basically present to the executives how they want to see the architecture, okay, for that. And generally speaking, you also do stakeholder management. So you understand your stakeholders and you present the architecture in ways that are meaningful to them. All stakeholders have concerns. If you're dealing with a security architect, present the architecture from a security perspective. If you're dealing with an information architect, information perspective, an executive, from an executive perspective. You're dealing with the chief financial officer, take a look from the financial perspective. So these are the type of things that you're going to have to take a look at. I'll answer that question with respect to Agile momentarily. You have insufficient user commitment. One of the key issues within enterprise architecture frameworks are basically the identification of business transformation issues. Okay, and you have to get the users, they often slide into the old goal of, well, I've used it for 100 years, it should be good. And they're not willing. You might have a wonderful solution, but you know, they're too busy. And generally speaking, what you want to do is often they fall asleep when you present them with the enterprise architecture. You have to get them excited about it. Best way to get them excited, because remember, I was one of those foxes, you know, when they were dealing with it, and I ended up in the research establishment working in what is now called an innovation lab for 3 years. And essentially we were building the future. So we were brought in to build the future, and then we brought in people to test it on a consistent basis in these test beds, innovation facilities. So you have to know what the organization is. Project cost overruns. One of the major problems is that, like, having been in civil engineering, yeah, you do have cost overruns. but fewer of them. And the estimation process is much more rigorous. I find in the IT field, generally speaking, because there's not a definitive work breakdown structure, is that getting to a decent cost estimate, be it class A, B, or C, or whatever you're using within your organization, is extremely difficult. So often these cost estimates are way under budget. And yes, requirements tend to morph over time. But the thing is, you do a requirements impact statement and say, okay, fine, we want to do it this way. It's going to cost an extra $10 million. Take a look at firearms. I mean, that was a classic case of cost overrun. Ended up starting as a sort of an Excel spreadsheet, and there you go. Okay. But what happens is you're going to get the mass, you're always going to get contra changes. So what you have to do is factor them in and take a look at the implications of the changes. And a lot of the resources, for example, in Ottawa, one of the primary resources you have is money, okay, that you can basically invest in certain areas. So you need to have project charters, well-defined work breakdown structures. I mean, that's what I'm teaching the students in school, like the concept of a work breakdown structure. And when you get grad students, for them, it's totally foreign. They're so used to working in the technology side of the house and introducing new technologies. The concept of planning is very foreign to them. And this is something that, you know, we're going to try and bring back into the fold, not just for engineering management. All engineers, once or 2 or 3 years post-graduation, are working on project planning. That's invariable. You know, my daughters and some, you know, like I said, I've got 2 engineer daughters, and their husbands, they're engineers. And let me tell you, they spend most of their time doing it. And they weren't prepared for it at the university level. They had to learn a lot of this on the job. Okay, for that. When you're dealing with project schedule delays, what you do have with enterprise architecture is a well-dependent set of dependencies between the various deliverables. Enterprise architecture looks at a project as a delivery vehicle for a deliverable. They don't really care about the project. They care about the deliverable because other projects, other deliverables need it to work. If you're providing, for example, we had in one organization we're doing an audit on in the Canadian government was master data management. Okay, it's a fundamental requirement. Every project was dealing with it itself because nobody had identified it as a common service. So as a consequence, you had multiple master data management systems, and well, I don't have to get into details, but that created a mess unto itself. Okay, for it. So the dependencies and the planning, enterprise architecture really facilitates that. And that comes, like I said, that's my background, is plans and operations. Okay, it really, and then when you deliver deliverables, the stuff fits together, and you don't need another architecture, which is called an integration architecture, showing how the pieces fit together. And often what happens is only consultancies make tons of money off this, but it's a real waste. And then the other one is insufficient project management and control. Well, risk management, incremental delivery, constant revision, architecture is dynamic. This is all part and parcel of enterprise architecture. And you know what, if you use an enterprise architecture, you don't get this bright idea project. You put your framework together, what you want to achieve, and then you projectize the elements of that framework and how they fit together. So as a consequence, I've seen organizations where you could reduce the number of projects by 50%. That's not trivial because every project consumes a great, many resources. So this is just one other way that enterprise architecture contributes to it. So what I wanted to do is just basically summarize, you know what I mean? When you're dealing with all these failure factors and you're dealing with how enterprise architecture addresses them, enterprise architecture supports the management issues that underlie the massive failures in digital transformation. Okay? And even if you don't get down to 5%, even if you get it down to 20% failure, look how many billions of dollars you're going to be saving. I use billions with a B. Okay, I could almost use trillions globally. So enterprise architecture is not a technology domain. Enterprise architecture was initially conceived as a business management, a structured planning methodology, using a lot of the more quantitative analytical techniques that are used in engineering. Now, concluding material. I've rambled on. Hopefully, I've made some sense. Digital transformation, enterprise architecture is not the only thing. You got your breakthrough strategy. You want to get into a blue ocean. Generally speaking, you should be using strategy maps in conjunction with enterprise architecture. And then you can use business techniques, techniques like blue ocean strategy and all that. That's fine, however you want to do it. You got to measure the transformation. You've got to keep a grip that basically the outcomes are being realized. And then you also have to manage the transformation, which is good governance, capability management, and service management. Enterprise architecture is one piece of a large toolkit, but it's a critical one. Okay, where is enterprise architecture? This is the Australian government architecture version 2. It's not under the CIO. It's under planning and budgeting at the government and departmental level. And it's no different in the private sector. And you're working alongside people doing business improvement, budget formulation, legal advice. And believe me, with privacy, you better get the legal advice. We work very tightly with the lawyers at ESDC when we were doing modernizing service to Canadians. Okay, and they were a great help to us. Outcomes and outputs, procurement planning, procurement and government, that's always a fun part. And then you got strategic planning, workforce planning. You're not dealing with the guys in the technical weeds. However, with enterprise architecture, one of the advantages is that you get it's no longer the enterprise architects receiving the business objectives. They take an integral part. So you're introducing technology expertise into the strategic investment planning process. This is just an example because I know that enterprise architecture is not normally found in this area. Okay, I think there's maybe 3 government departments out of about 200 that have it there in Canadian government. I'm doing a study on that right now. So, challenges of digital transformation frameworks. This is another one that you basically have to take a look at. A lot of these frameworks like COBIT, where you're align, plan, and organize, build, acquire, and implement, deliver service and support, monitor, evaluate, and assess. It's not just that I'm a SACA, but that's a good framework for figuring it out. You've got TOGAF in there. You've got the portfolio management standards. You've got the ITIL standards, V3. It's up to V3 or V4 is actually all of ITIL V3 is basically overlapping. So what you've got is all these frameworks that people are implementing and are getting into each other, into each other's space. And they're doing things differently. It's causing a lot of confusion. These are just a few of the standards that I've highlighted that are relevant with respect to the digital field. This is problematic. Last time I was in government, what I tried to do was integrate the stuff at ITIL is the IT service management, integrate that with the enterprise architecture repository so that people could at least see what was going on in the field and get the baseline architecture sort of. They refused to cooperate. Okay, this wasn't a government department, and this was at the executive level. They said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with that. So all the people in planning had no idea what was happening out in the quality of service of the digital services that were being provided. This is a real problem. I know I spend in academia and I work in various professional associations where we try to deconflict or at least harmonize how the frameworks play together in the same space. But this really bedevils management and executive challenges. And I know now they're forming all these digital transformation offices and everything else. This is the key in management consulting you have to sort out. Who's doing what where? And if there is overlap, how does it overlap? Okay, and how do they play together in the same field? And how do you share the same governance information? Governance is the absolute key. So without further ado, we're having a digital transformation government conference where we're basically addressing a great many of these issues. Conference dates 14th to 16th of June. It's all virtual. And the sessions are recorded so registrants can watch it at their convenience. Okay, which is great. And we've got more than 50 speakers. A lot of them are executives. Well, most of them are executives, managers, practitioners, and we've got academia, and they're looking at best practices and case studies. So it's not a marketing spiel. Okay, it's basically case study based, and also they talk about where their pain points are. CPEs, for those of you, I think you have professional development units or, in CMC, they will be provided for both live and recorded presentations. So if you watch it later, you can ask for they call them CPEs in because of the ISACA, that's the term they use. Registration and conference details go to Digital Transform. There's also on the 17th an open source journal workshop. We're looking at creating an open source journal that will consist of both practitioner and thought leader articles, peer reviewed, to bring them together. Right now, there's many journals, they're all hidden behind firewalls, and they're not accessible to individuals. This will be accessible to both students and at the same time, and also practitioners, so your consultancies. You'll be able to access the open educational resources that we create with these. So open source journal, we're looking at getting an editorial staff and dealing with both practitioner and peer reviewed articles. We want to get the academia involved. Because let me tell you, if you've got problems in your organization, academia is not a bad way to basically put a little bit of seed research funding, and they'll put some brain power at it. And I've seen the students, some of them are just remarkable. For that. There's also sponsorship and partnership opportunities if you want. Now, this workshop is not just one association. It's basically a lot of it's thrust by the ISACA, Ottawa Valley Chapter, but it's also the Association of Enterprise Architects, University of Ottawa, Digital Transformation Innovation Program, Certified Management Consultants of Canada. Thank you very much. Ontario has been involved in that one. The Canadian Information Processing Society has been heavily involved. Dalhousie University, School of Public Administration, and one in tech is where we're trying to promote women to go into the technology fields. We are desperately short of resources. And the cyber side, we maybe have 10 to 20% of the resources we actually need. Okay, so there's a shortage of 70. If you want a job for life, cybersecurity is certainly an area to venture into. So that's what we're doing at the workshop. Easy to get into. Love to see you. Cost is marginal, especially if you want to get PDUs. But the whole idea is to get people that are doing the stuff and some of the pain points. And as from a consultant, you basically get to know what's happening. And it's not just here. We've got speakers from Asia, United Nations, Open Group, Europe, Africa. They're coming from all over. And they're going to be talking about their pain points. We have 3 concurrent strides. So anyways, at this point in time, I'll just turn it over to questions. I hope you found this useful. Jennifer, do you want me just to go to take a look at the chat?
I can just rail off a few. I wanted to thank you because I thought it was very interesting, very helpful, in depth. I've learned a lot, and I have some questions, but I'm going to leave it. I'll go to the chats that came in, but Milo should ask if the Zachman model is still relevant use, particularly today.
Yes, we still use it. The Zachman model. Okay, sorry, I'll just go.
Yeah.
Just go to the front here because it's important. When you look at the basis of enterprise architecture, basically, you take a look at these domains, they're all based on the Zachman model. Okay, this is rows 1 and 2, this is column 1, this is column 2, this is column 3. Security architecture is sort of pervasive. And the motivation column, which is not a discrete domain, but that's often in the policy and in the part of the vision now within the architectures. So the Zachman framework is still used. We use the extension of the Zachman framework that was put in place by the School of Business at the University of Chicago by Stephen Spiewak, Enterprise Architecture Planning, because the Zachman framework is sort of a snapshot of the organization at a point in time. What you really need are several snapshots as the organization proceeds towards it, converges on a target state. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Now there was another question with respect to, okay, sorry.
Well, there's another question that Stephen had. You touched upon it a bit. What should be the role of the CDOs in relation to the CIOs? And you talked about the CIOs have become the CTOs, which has led to the creation of the CDOs. But maybe you could talk about the gap that you identified between the I and IT, and what do you see as the risk that might be emerging with the having these separate, possibly siloed offices?
Okay. I know it's being recorded, so but I'm still sort of tend to work in an academic environment, so I'm pretty blunt. A lot of the CDOs are having a great deal of difficulty dealing with the current CIOs. Okay.
Yeah.
I would prefer that they use the term chief knowledge officer.
Mhm.
And that's not a new term. I was dealing with chief knowledge officers in Australia back in the early 2000s, and we're dealing with organizations like CRA. Okay, so these are tax offices and the like. These are large organizations. It's gotten off the rails. People tend to reorganize rather than get to the root causes of the problems. There's no reason the CIOs couldn't have been rebadged as chief knowledge officers and basically addressed the knowledge issue, but they just were mesmerized by the technology. The current CDOs are going to have to get into positions. There's going to be confrontation between the CIO and CDO. So if you're a management consultant putting it in, you've got to get the terms of reference properly done, and you've got to take a look at stakeholder analysis to figure out whether the individuals will be able to work together. The CDO will not be able to do their job without the technology, and the CTO will not be able to succeed unless they're providing the right information, especially when we're going into Internet of Things. The new environment is going to be incredibly complex. There was another question with respect to Agile. Do you mind if I answer that one, Jennifer?
Yeah, you got that? Yeah, Milos, that was Milos again.
Okay, now Milos, you were saying is Agile. Enterprise architecture is not static. You don't just do it and put it on a shelf, and some organizations do, okay? But the whole idea is dynamic, and you go through it on a regular basis. I would say annually, okay? And what happens is you're constantly taking a look, is the vision still relevant? Is the definition still relevant? You know, essentially, is the planning still working? And you're going to find a lot of lessons learned. So you have to basically recap them. Certain things that you're going to try and do aren't going to work. I can guarantee you that. The minute you start implementing a plan, it goes off the rails. That's sort of rule one, Murphy's Law. So what you have to do is you constantly have to adjust it. Projects might all of a sudden find when you're doing with compliance, they can't be compliant because some of the technology you've asked them to use isn't mature enough. Or they're having troubles with it. Or there's a new law passed, which all of a sudden, especially if you work in a global company and you have to basically be the data protection, the general data protection regulations in the EU, for example, which are a lot of them are based on PPD and some of the Canadian legislation, actually. And that has forced companies to rethink their architecture. There might be a new security threat. I'll give you an example, quantum computing. What impact is that going to have on your security? On all your cryptology, you know, basically your encrypted websites and your single sign-ons and so on and so forth. So enterprise architecture is constantly evolving. Don't look at it as something that's static. Now, the vision, what you like to do is have something that's fairly stable and then have a lot more of the stuff that's unstable down in this particular area here. And the lack of stability is not just in terms of the technology. It's also in terms of the business processes. Okay, so there's a huge management component to it, and you're going to have to change your governance. I can guarantee you that. Okay, for that. Sorry. Okay, so
Patrick has a comment there in relation to inter-enterprise architecture. So really looking at codependent companies working in an ecosystem such as health, where each organization has its own CIO, CTO, CDO. And what are your comments on that about the integration across these?
That's called the extra price. Okay, where you're dealing with, like, supply chain is a good example. Like I said, an enterprise architecture deals with, you know, I didn't get into interoperability. You didn't have time for it today, but you have to find out, like, what do you have to share? How are you going to share information? When you get organizations like NATO, how can organizations all of a sudden plug in without compromising the security of the information within, you know, NATO itself? The federal government is another good example. Health is not within the federal mandate. But for example, like they basically have to share health information on a dynamic basis. COVID was an excellent example. How do you get reliable statistics for COVID? Is everybody counting a COVID case in the hospital the same way? Okay, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the extra prize deals with external interoperability. And you can, there are various ways of doing interoperability. Interoperability is defined as the ability to share information and services, which is generally what you have to do. Supply chain is a classic example, but it's got to be transparent. On the other hand, they're not part of your organization. So you have to have standards upon which you can agree.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I worked on health in a large project, and the biggest problem we had was enterprise architecture being developed by each organization, but each of the enterprise architectures were different. And what lacked was what I call the interorganizational or your extra price architecture. And if you look at the failure of large projects, just take Phoenix and gun registry, those are great examples of the inter-organizational enterprise, which is missing. And it falls very close to the data lake and the data standards necessary for success of that ecosystem. So I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, well, I work with the Open Group on data lakes and it's information integration. Phoenix is interesting, okay? When you look at Phoenix, one of the big problems with Phoenix is the costing, okay? And Shared Services Canada is another one, because Phoenix is just one example. But there you had one system that was supposed to subsume I don't know how many other systems. Mm-hmm. Data migration, which is an integral part of the enterprise architecture framework, just wasn't, to my knowledge, wasn't done. I know public servants that haven't been properly paid in 6 years. You know, so I don't consider Phoenix to be the extra prize. It's really the enterprise, the Canadian government. For that. And so what happens is you have internal and external interoperability challenges. There's a standard called NIEM, the National Information Exchange Model, that they use in the United States, NIEM. That's now being used in a great many departments to basically facilitate interdepartmental information sharing. Okay, so believe that will solve a lot of problems. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to transactions between the data sets between the various organizations which are necessary for the ecosystem. So you mentioned supply chain, 100% agree with everything you've said here. This is great to hear. The challenge in the real world, though, is the government, is the federal government one organization or multiple organizations? And now you're getting into the structured conversations at the beginning of the whole broad picture and the transformational change.
Okay. The business operating model of the federal government is diversified. Okay, if you want to use the business operating model concept, and the CIO used it, it's a diversified model, but in some of the departments, it's unified. Okay, if you understand what I mean, so they have different business models. What you have to do is you have to figure out what the business model is and create an enterprise architecture that accommodates it. So the enterprise architecture that accommodates the interdepartmental and the Treasury Board and the high-level government of Canada might not suit, for example, Health Canada, where to be dealing with a much more unified business model. Do you understand? Am I making myself clear? Whereas, you know, government is probably the most complex environment that you're going to get. The National Information Exchange Model is a classic example of where they're trying to get multi-jurisdictional service delivery. We tried that in the SDC. You know, in the mid 2000s, between about 2004, 2005, we're also dealing with the portals, the government online. And it was a major nightmare because there was no overarching architecture. Believe it or not, it just takes a political will and not much work to make it work. From the stakeholders. So anyways, like I said, I don't want to wax poetic here. We don't, you know, like I said, I can talk about this offline. I'd be delighted to. So health is a good case in point of multi-jurisdictional service delivery and some of the challenges they have. I know CIHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, CIHI, Canadian Institute for Health Information, and the like are good. Yeah. And Secure Channel was, I was involved in Secure Channel many years ago. There was a question about the difference between data, knowledge, and information.
Yeah.
I know I teach that, and I basically made a presentation to that at the IM Community of Practice in the Canadian government. I've been dealing on the knowledge side since the 80s. AI is where I started work. Okay, from the business, I went straight to AI and knowledge engineering and expert systems. And it's still a work in progress. What's information to some person is data to another. That's one of the issues too. We found that in the military, so we just stopped to a certain extent differentiating to it. One of the ways you can say is that information is simply a viewpoint onto the data. And the information is something that's meaningful to the person seeing it. As long as they're dealing with the same, data, so people can see it in different ways. Some people might on a dashboard, somebody might want to see it in a report. Those are called viewpoints. All these structures are within enterprise architecture and the stakeholder management portion. So what we're trying to do is address it. The knowledge portion, you can't do knowledge management unless you've got a grip on your data. To be perfectly honest with you, it's absolutely key. And if you get a proper information sharing environment, then it basically allows you to do the analytics that you really want to do. Like I said, I don't want to go into an architectural discussion here, but there are ways of putting it together. The data lakes are just the most recent aspect of sort of a portal. The old portal architectures were dealing with that spot on. Anyways, I'd be more than glad to, I can give a presentation on that because I'm working with that in the open group for new information architecture standards, where we deal with the different types of knowledge and information and how they're defined.
I just have a question. I'm trying to formulate it in my head because I think like the factors impacting what you talked about business transformation success are really basic ones that are linked to barriers or theories of change. Adcar Carter, I could go on and on, the process methodology. How do you see fixing this? So you have examples of Phoenix, otherwise S4HANA. They've been trying to move that way in government. It's just a common platform across departments. And I was talking to one CFO and she's like, yeah, we were supposed to have that in place a few years ago and we're looking still 5 years out. So nobody does anything because they're trying to get there. Like, how do you break down these silos? So you talk about it government wide of looking at, political leadership. Otherwise, I look at it even just in one department that has a ton of change initiatives going on, like modernizing financial management systems, all system related, modernizing real property systems related, new IT enabled systems, procurement, HR, they're all going on. Nothing's integrated, nothing's sequenced. There's, again, the lack of investment. So I feel like this is really systemic throughout government. There's just a really difficult challenge of trying to bring more of that enterprise, whether you're talking about at an organizational level or you're talking government wide. So I just wonder what your perspectives are, because I'm challenged on an ongoing basis, and you enterprise like digital transformation is on a much larger scale. But that when you talk about CIs, CDOs, CTOs, CSOs, blah, blah, I can just see like the never ending, these silos and competition for resources and profile and everything else. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I fully agree. It's organized, reorganized, disorganized. I knew some organizations that reorganized 4 times in 5 years, and by the end of it, nobody knew what their what the terms of reference were. The issue is, for example, take a look at the definition of digital transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Customer-centric value proposition. What improvement to the lives of Canadians was Phoenix, Shared Services Canada, the email consolidation? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Okay. So they spent a ton of money. It hasn't worked. And now they're working on Son of Phoenix, okay, or Daughter of Phoenix. I don't want to be, Child of Phoenix, okay. So all of a sudden now we've got these massive projects that failed. A lot of them due to it was just bad management.
Mm.
And you know, digital transformation's customer-centric value proposition. They want to get out of people. I often show it as a balancing scale between efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah.
And the CIOs are always looking at efficiency, whereas the business people are always looking at effectiveness. Effectiveness is not necessarily that pretty behind the scenes, but it works and it provides business value to the customers. And I think that's the way the digital transformation officers, because some of the CDOs are really chief digital officers, they've got to focus on effectiveness to the client, which are the people of Canada, and to the Canadian business and the Canadian economy, for example, in Canadian government. The minute you use your client-centric focus, you're going to get into trouble. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's one way to smash part silos, is saying is, what are you doing to contribute to client, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're doing that for the clients.
Yeah. Okay.
The benefit realization, yeah, it's the same thing, but the benefits, it's not for internal benefits as much as it is for who your clients. Like, I've seen the government change. I was just victimized by that yesterday. One of the government agencies, I just had to pay a simple bill. Well, it's turned into, rather than we don't take credit cards anymore, and we have to do this. You know what I mean? Compromising all my banking information just for a simple $10 fee. You know what I mean? And like, why did they do that? There is no logical reason. Okay. It was basically somebody in their right mind basically looked at it and said, well, it's going to be more efficient. We might save 1%. And that's what a lot of companies are doing, is they're looking at their own internal business benefit rather than the client business benefit. But just fire me off a question. I normally try to answer them. Yeah, I use my University of Ottawa address. That's the one I monitor. So
it's on the slides, and you're going to get copies of them, so you'll be able to track down Bob. He's pretty busy for the next week or so, so maybe he might not respond for a little bit. But Bob, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. It took us a while to get this organized, so appreciate your patience and appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Sandra, I wanted to thank you for managing it in the background. If you can download the chat even now, there's lots of links in there, and not only in relation to the conference next week, as a reminder for CMCs to go back and register and get access to the Great Catalyst 2022 conference as well. So thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate it, and stay tuned for a new lineup come the fall. Enjoy your summer. Thanks, Bob. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.